Thank you. Thanks. First of all, let me just thank you, Norm. Let me say congratulations on a really impressive initiative that you've had going for a number of years and got a huge shot in the arm when Hank dragooned a bunch of us, Hank Greenberg being one of the most extraordinary leaders, I think, of his generation, and probably for several generations, given that he's in his 90s now and still going, and has reinvented himself a couple of times. And few people realize, by the way, that Hank went ashore on D-Day with the Rangers and then returned to active duty after, I think, finishing the business school at Columbia for the Korean War as well, where he commanded a company. Some of you, though, are probably wondering, what in the world's a general doing on a stage at an infrastructure conference? And I probably should offer that for the last 6.5 years or so, I've been a member of KKR. I was made a partner about 5 years ago. I chair their Global Institute, which does the geopolitical risk, integrates the macroeconomic analysis and the environmental social governance issues analysis when we're doing diligence on deals. It's been an extraordinary run for the firm during that period. We've gone from 83 billion to about 210 billion under management. And we do a fair amount of infrastructure work. There's only 3 water treatment plants and huge processing centers in the country that have actually been privatized. We did 2 of those. We own the biggest pipeline in America, Colonial Pipeline. We have huge gas and oil and energy resources, a lot of alternative energy, solar, wind, and you could just go on and on. And it's really been quite exciting to be in that arena. For what it's worth, also, the PhD I did was in economics and international relations, both of which I taught at West Point, and I've had several academic appointments since then at the City University of New York, USC, out on the West Coast, and at Harvard as a fellow. In fact, I'm going up there after this. And the course I taught at the Honors College of the City University of New York was titled The North American Decades, which was my thesis, if you will, that what follows the American century is not yet the Chinese century. It's actually the North American decades, this 3-country market that was created by NAFTA and now will be reinforced, hopefully, with the new NAFTA, the US, Mexico, Canada agreement. And in that, the real driver has been 4 big revolutions which the US has led. The IT revolution, the basis for an awful lot of this. The energy revolution, which is truly extraordinary, and we've got some people in here that know that and actually participated and drove that. It is the manufacturing revolution, and then it's the life sciences revolution. In many cases, what is keeping us from fully capitalizing on these revolutions has to do with infrastructure. The truth is we're seeing a lot of infrastructure work done around the world, around the country, and also around the world. But I travel endlessly, usually 25 countries or so. Boots on the ground still matter, and that's very important, but all over the United States. And frankly, the much criticized airports, for example. All 3 in the New York area are gradually, painstakingly, frustratingly being overhauled. A variety of others all around the world and around our country. The challenge, though, is that the infrastructure that connects them in many cases, it is the roads, bridges, tunnels, rail systems, and all the rest of that, are not being upgraded, are not being improved to the extent that these other very visible elements are. And it's very, very clear that infrastructure in particular that improves productivity of American workers is crucial. Because as you all know, at the end of the day, your growth in GDP is a product of your labor force times the productivity of that labor force, noting that increasingly that labor force may be machines, robots, automation, not just humans. But that key element of productivity that is missing, where I very strongly agreed with Hank Greenberg when he asked me to be one of the founding members of the effort he's leading, has to do with infrastructure. And so that's why I end up on this stage and why Norm was able to get me to happily actually to be here with you all.
Well, thank you very much. So what we're going to do is go through a few questions, and then we'd like to open it up to the audience. So think of what you'd like to ask the general, and let's focus on infrastructure and how we generate an infrastructure build in our country, or as we've been discussing, how we generate an infrastructure surge in our country. So, General, our country clearly needs a major infrastructure initiative, doubling the level of investment for a period of 10 years. How do we do that? You've participated in a number of transformational exercises.
So the surge that mattered most in Iraq was not the surge of forces, it was the surge of ideas. It was a complete overhaul of the big ideas that were guiding our strategy. And we pulled these big ideas out of the manual that we wrote, the Army and the Marine Corps together. Jim Mattis was my partner in the Marine Corps at the time, during the time between my 3-star and 4-star tours in Iraq. I'd already had some 2.5 years on the ground. We tried to distill the lessons. And the keys here were that we recognized, as an example, that we needed to, first and foremost, secure the people. The human terrain is the decisive terrain. We could only do that at that stage in the conflict, which had re-escalated very dramatically, by living with them once again. And yet we have been consolidating on big bases and handing off to the Iraqis a level of violence they couldn't handle. So this is a 180-degree transition, by the way, over the objection of the Prime Minister of Iraq, who issued a series of demands through his National Security Advisor in the first few days I was there, at the end of which I said, if that's truly what the Prime Minister wants to do, I'd appreciate him telling President Bush tomorrow in the normally scheduled video conference, which I understand the General and the Ambassador attend. It was still Zal Khalilzad at that time, not yet Ryan Crocker. And I said, if he does that, he should know that if he wants to pursue his ideas instead of the ones that we're going to implement, he's going to do it without me, because I'll be on the next plane to Washington and I will take the policy with me. Fairly big moment. The big ideas are what mattered. And the truth is that I think the big ideas have proven a bit elusive about infrastructure in America. At the end of the day, another key to the surge was that the chief executive took control of it in Washington. He no longer subcontracted to his Secretary of Defense as he had up until that moment. He took it over, and every Monday morning, 7:30 Monday morning Eastern Standard Time to 8:30, there was a video conference that he conducted from the White House, the Situation Room, with his entire national security team there, directly with the ambassador and me. This is unprecedented. So he took charge of this. So as we look at, what are the analogies, what are the lessons we can learn from that particular surge to how you would apply a surge in infrastructure, which again, I think, if you ask what is the most bipartisan issue around which you could galvanize action in this city, it probably would be infrastructure investment. All the others have, you might have some champions here or there, but nowhere do you find the kind of bipartisan support. Now, you might have to swallow, and if you're in the White House, accept that perhaps the gateway to, this is for all of us Acela corridor people, because if my office is in New York, we live here, that, you'd have to do that from the White House, and maybe the other side would have to do something that they've been a little bit reluctant to support. But at the end of the day, somebody's got to drive it from the White House. Ideally, it is the chief executive. I mean, even more ideally, this is so important for the country, actually, especially when you compare our infrastructure to that of the rest of the world, that maybe it is 7:30 on a Monday morning to 8:30. There is a video conference or a gathering or what have you to galvanize and show who's in charge. There could be some others, but if they're not absolutely empowered by the president, it is not going to work. Again, maybe Larry Kudlow, who sort of has this in his portfolio, but he's got a lot of issues in his portfolio, could take it on. Then perhaps there's a cabinet champion for it. Maybe it is, again, the Secretary of Transportation, Elaine Chao, who's got reasonably good relationships on Capitol Hill as well, of course. We're working with me here now. Remember who her husband is. But that's what it would take. Yes, it's an election year, but if there's one issue, again, on which everyone agrees, it is infrastructure. And when the price of money is, very near zero, even Larry Summers had said, this is the time. If you're going to run a deficit over something, it ought to be over infrastructure spending that improves productivity. Now, that's not it alone, though. Also, you want to create incentives so that you get private investment firms to also get very aggressive in this particular area. By the way, state and local have done this pretty effectively in many cases. So again, that could be yet another area. And then beyond actually what would be appropriated funds strictly for infrastructure, you still have, obviously, the funds that would come through normal appropriations, whether it's a transportation highway bill or a variety of other areas. And if you put all of that together, you start to get close to the $1 trillion that I think is probably needed, even if it's just for a one-time investment. I was a champion actually of using the revenue that we would have achieved, and did achieve actually, from the repatriation. You know, we've had about $3 trillion offshore until the tax cuts and so forth. If you ran that tax way down, somewhere in the neighborhood of 10 or 12.5 or whatever percent for a period of time, the calculations were that we thought you could reap anywhere from 250 to 300 billion just from that. Now that's been done in part to pay for the tax cuts that were approved by Congress. I would have loved to have seen a one-time tax cut go to a one-time investment rather than perhaps an ongoing again, but be that as it may. But again, this would have to be the big idea. This is the way you would go about it, conceptualizing it, I think. There's nothing novel about this except that we haven't done it. Right. And again, I mean, a lot of people after the surge in Iraq came to me, of course you had to live with the people. Of course you had to take back control from the Iraqis. Of course you had to promote reconciliation with the mid and lower levels of the insurgents and the militias because we couldn't kill or capture our way out of an industrial strength insurgency. Of course you had to stop releasing detainees until you got the extremists out of their midst and had a rehabilitation program. I said, you're exactly right. Of course we did, except that we weren't doing it. Of course we need to invest in infrastructure. Of course we need to do it in a comprehensive way that incorporates appropriated funds, private funds that are incentivized, and then normal, so one-time appropriations and also normal appropriations that we see that often fund this. And of course you've got to have somebody from the White House driving this, ideally, again, the chief executive, as President Bush did for his 2 final years in office when he drove from Washington support in the interagency for the surge in Iraq and empowered his commander and his ambassador in a way that is truly unique in our history. It had not occurred prior to the surge. He hadn't done it. You remember, he had basically allowed his Secretary of Defense to run the war. Of course, he also replaced the Secretary of Defense with the great Secretary Bob Gates. Chairman Admiral Mullen came in, and so on. But that's what is required, and then everything else followed. Because he had a video conference, of course, on Tuesdays, the Secretary of Defense had a video conference for a full hour starting at 7:30 Eastern Standard Time with me alone in this case. Of course, state had to do it with ambassador, and it rippled on out from there. But that's where you've got to start. The big idea is pretty straightforward. It then comes down to, do you actually embrace the big idea? Do you operationalize it? Do you do that, of course, in an election year, which is tough, but actually try to forge some bipartisan. By the way, I should note that I stopped voting when I became a 2-star general. I don't register, I don't contribute, I don't endorse, and I will give advice to members of either party and of any cabinet if they'll be receptive to it.
Great. Thank you very much. So you mentioned Gateway, General, and that's really interesting. You know, we did with BCG, we did a study of 30 projects, and what we showed was that those 30 projects, private investment projects, would generate jobs in more than 50% of the congressional districts for the next 40 years. So the idea that, you know, you have a project like Gateway, critical to the country, which is a partisan project, makes no sense. Our infrastructure is incredibly bipartisan.
By the way, we are doing the terminus at Penn Station. For those of you who have struggled through the existing Penn Station and realize how terribly inadequate it is, there is a new Penn Station that will open, I think it's next summer or fall, somewhere in there. We've actually toured it, the KKR partners, and we know the individual who's running, who's seriously impressive. And that is going to be really an enormous upgrade for New York and for that particular terminus of Amtrak and especially the Acela.
And it's only taken us 40 years to do that.
Yeah. Again, things take time, but they can go a lot faster if somebody drives them.
Absolutely. So the second question I wanted to ask you is, we're talking, I think, about also major private investment, our pension funds, bipartisan selection of priority projects. So how do we focus on great projects? How do we identify those projects? And then how do we rebuild our business infrastructure? When I started my business 30 years ago, I couldn't go anywhere in the world where U.S. companies weren't building roads, airports, highways, et cetera. It doesn't happen anymore, and I think that it's pretty clear that we need to create national champions as well so that we can go out and compete, for instance, with the Chinese on the Belt and
Well, again,
Road
there's a
project.
lot of big questions in here. I mean, one is, first of all, what do you do domestically? And then second, what do you do in foreign terms? And in the latter, the replacement of OPIC with what is going to be called the International Development Finance Corporation, or DFC is the acronym, and doubling its assets under management from 30 to 60 billion. That is a fairly considerable and important step. I'd love to see it even more than that. Obviously, the Belt and Road Initiative is many multiples of that. But if you actually did that, and that is being done, and then you couple that with, say, Japanese, other like-minded countries, EU, and others, and coordinate that, all of a sudden you have a very considerable amount of resources that you could deploy. And the key is, again, in that particular case, working with partners and with allies around the world, which is something that's hugely important. When it comes to domestic, I mean, everybody in here knows you've got to allow the private investors to make a profit. Mm-hmm. And if you structure it in a way that allows them to do that, you actually don't have to pick the winners or losers, the market will. I mean, that's the genius of the United States. We were talking earlier, if you go back to the energy revolution and think about why is it that only in the United States of America is there an energy revolution? Keep in mind the magnitude of this. We have gone from what energy economists, a year or two before I took over as CIA director, they called it peak oil. Yeah. Peak oil production was 6 million barrels per day. And it was all downhill from there. And then all of a sudden something happens. And I remember looking at this when we were trying to predict what the price of Brent crude would be after each round of sanctions on Iran, because the agency has some terrific energy economists, turned out to be the best in the business, something I remind the then Treasury Secretary every time I see him in New York, that our economists got the prediction right. The bottom line, though, is that what was happening was the impact of the energy revolution in the U.S. And again, it's only in the U.S. There are several countries around the world which have far more oil and gas in their dense rock than we have, others that have very substantial numbers, only substantial production here. And keep in mind, we have gone from 6 million barrels per day to probably it's somewhere in the neighborhood of 12.4 or 5 million barrels per day now, and still climbing, depending on, of course, what the market prices. This has happened here for a handful of reasons. First of all, we invented the technology of deep directional drilling, hydraulic fracturing, and seismic big data, and now the seismic even in the drill bits. Second, we have small and medium enterprises that can build this out very, very quickly, have a lot of expertise in the wildcatters of the United States. Third, there's agile capital markets that can invest in those. And again, we're very much part of that at KKR. Fourth, you have a legal provision where you can sell or rent mineral rights underneath your land. That is unique to the U.S. Then we also have reasonable infrastructure for pushing around. We're doing more of that, obviously, and now we've been building gasification plants liquefaction plants rather than gasification when we thought we'd be importing natural gas rather than exporting it. And the tankers, all the other infrastructure is gradually being expanded. And we have a reasonable regulatory process that has allowed at a reasonable pace approval of various elements of this infrastructure, but not so fast that it's willy-nilly and we're going to do enormous damage to the environment. Again, you don't find those anywhere else in the world. And that's why only in the United States do you have a true energy revolution. What happened? I mean, markets happened, investment happened. And again, because they calculate that there's a profit to be made. And again, the market is pretty good at deciding which investments are valuable for them, and that should be okay. Yeah. There is a challenge occasionally with state and local, and there's a resistance. Oh my gosh, you might actually make high single digits or low double digit, depending on how many times you lever it and all the rest of this. Look, that's okay. Do you want the investment or not? Right. And again, that has to be, I think, understood and accepted. It shouldn't be excessive, certainly. That should be curtailed. But that's the key. And our markets do work. And if the incentive structure is right, and again, governments at all levels have a lot to do with that, and the regulatory system is proper, I think then you have a success.
So, one more question, and then I think I'll open it up to the audience. But if you look at how we make infrastructure decisions, there's no infrastructure budget, there's no infrastructure department, there's no infrastructure unit in the White House. And on the infrastructure issue, Congress is structured pretty much like it was in 1946, really looking at public works way before digitization or any of the complexity happened. And I remember I was driving into work one day early in the morning, and I was listening to Secretary Gates give his valedictory as Secretary of Defense. And the level of command of detail, the level of knowledge, the level of obvious control he had over our national security was extraordinary. And I was thinking to myself, who in the world would have that over infrastructure, which is actually as important as the national defense structure? So the question I have for it in terms of our modern world, and the question I have is, what institutions do we need to create so that an infrastructure initiative, an infrastructure surge, could be successful?
Well, again, let's start, I think, with the biggest of the big ideas, which is that somebody from the White House with enormous, either the authority of the president or the president himself has to drive this. Presumably in that, again, in the White House, greater White House, you're going to have a team that helps him do that, just as you had for the surge, again, I mean, it's basically the National Security Council staff. That oversees what the executive branch is doing, and it also has an element that's working with the folks on Capitol Hill and in a variety of other locations to try to pull this together. I don't know if you'd call this the infrastructure czar. Again, the truth is the surge czar was the president of the United States. And as the surge went on, the amount of detail that the president had on what was going on the ground in security terms, political terms, the Iraqi political system, reconciliation, every component of a comprehensive civil military counterinsurgency campaign was quite impressive, to put it mildly. And very, very helpful because, when you're out there at the tactical end of things, even though we were at a strategic level within Iraq, it's really helpful to have the president sort of steadying hand from time to time and the reassurance and obviously the backing, the support. I mean, we knew somebody had our backs in Washington. Again, the question is, who could do that in the White House? Could someone other than the president be empowered sufficiently? I would think so. But again, it would be wonderful if the president himself would do it. And then what kind of structure do you have to help that individual to push this in a comprehensive way? And keeping in mind that this would extend well outside this city, not just to Congress, not just to the executive branch departments that would be feeding projects and analyses in, but to working with state and local and municipal governments as well. Now, that sounds complicated. It is. I think you'd find, you probably know far better than maybe anybody in this room. Number one, there's a ton of great projects out there. We're going to discuss some of those, I think, at the end of my time, or recognize them. And then beyond that, there's also a huge network of individuals who are already engaged in this. And all you really need to do is empower them at an additional level and enable them with greater resources and so forth to capitalize on the opportunities and the needs that are out there. It's going to take some political compromise, and I know that the word compromise has become a little bit radioactive in this great city, but it is more possible, I would contend, in this particular area than in perhaps any other, even in some of the social program areas.
Great. Well, thank you very much. I'm going to open it up to questions just because, General, we have a tremendously gifted group of people in the room from engineering construction companies, technology firms, financial institutions. And does anybody have any questions? Let's go with Will Rowe right there, and the microphone's right behind you, Will. General, Will's a troublemaker, so be careful with this.
I've encountered a troublemaker or two in my life.
General, thank you for your leadership.
Quite lethal weapons.
Thanks for your remarks about the revolutions we've seen in specific sectors and about future possibilities and the need for this surge in infrastructure investment. And Norm, I do want to thank you because you've been laser focused year after year since I've known you on doubling infrastructure investment in this country and more broadly. Your 50 critical national security projects years ago, all the work you did there, Blueprint 2025, many other efforts. So you've been laser focused on this, and here we are again, gathered on the same question. And I know you've touched on it, but I just wanted to ask you folks if you could talk about the fundamental reasons why the surge has not occurred, given all the opportunities we've had in the last 2 or 3 years. Is it just political? Do we need to do really something different? Or maybe the question is, given the campaigns are starting up, how do we get this back on the map as a true campaign issue? What can we do next? If you could just talk a little bit about that, give us some marching orders. Thank you.
Let me start, and then let me actually ask Norm to chime in and perhaps either build on or correct what it is that I say. Look, in general, when an endeavor doesn't proceed, I think generally it's because there is not sufficient leadership of that particular endeavor. And by the way, I think this would be true of leaders of either party, of successive administrations. There was an effort, certainly in the previous administration, during the stimulus in the wake of the Great Recession, to pursue shovel-ready projects, et cetera, all of that. You may recall that. Sadly, some of those were opposed by the party not in power at that point in time, during which it seemed that budget deficits were a great deal more important than they have apparently been in the last 2 years. But again, this is about coming together around something that is hugely important for our country, in which presumably there could actually be, again, bipartisan agreement. Noting there's lots of partisan issues that are out there, and those will all be surfaced during the respective parties' campaigns. You'd think that there would be one around which people could actually converge, and that would again be, and I want to emphasize this point again, this is not just any infrastructure. This is infrastructure that improves productivity of the United States, because again, it's the productivity element that is so important to multiply the effect of what you have in terms of labor. Noting, by the way, that demography in the US, we're still growing our labor force slowly. So unlike many of the other countries, developed countries around the world where demography is either in a death spiral or at least a downturn, ours is still modestly upward. And yes, complementing the human labor force now is the robot labor force. But at the end of the day, it is productivity enhancements that are really going to increase the potential GDP growth for our country. But go ahead, Norm, why don't you, I mean, you again have done this longer than I have.
Well, unsuccessfully, and you've done something successful. Look, the real point, I think, echoing on what General Petraeus has said throughout his remarks, is that, and it's the reason I wanted to get you involved as well, and it's the reason why Hank Greenberg's involved, because you have to get people involved who put the country first. The U.S. military's always put the country first. You need an institution that cares about the country. And I think, Will, you've got to raise this up to a different level. The general talked a little bit about the strategic versus the tactical level. It seems to me that the infrastructure conversation happens at the tactical level in the city all day long, with one association pushing something else and the other association not pushing something else. That's why we focus on projects. That's why you're right to say that focusing on 50 projects and trying to make that has the ability to transform the paradigm, and that's where a surge in ideas would come in. But we do need people at your level, General, and at the level of Hank Greenberg to really get this up to a different level, because the level of complexity of modern infrastructure and the level of importance is extraordinary, and the bureaucracy needs ready access to those kinds of ideas and those kinds of nudges. So that would be my answer. Another question? Thank you, Will.
And then the bureaucracy has to sort of capitulate at a certain point in time. I mean, again, it has to enable over time, not just delay.
Right.
And again, I want to see a regulatory process that is thorough, but not one that is so glacial that we never get there from here.
Right, 9.5 years to get a highway project approved on average is a problem. But I'll mention another thing, and you're aware of this, General. I was speaking a while ago, maybe a month ago, and there was a fellow from one of the US government agencies, and I said, look, why don't we allow our bureaucracy to move fast and make mistakes, and so they can innovate? And he found me later, about a week later, and he said, that was so refreshing. I wish somebody else would say that, because that's what we need. We're all dedicated civil servants. So I don't actually see the government as the problem. I see the government as the solution. And once we get a competent, once we have some high-level dedicated leadership with a surge of ideas, the bureaucracy, which is full of gifted people, will actually move into line. But right now, if they lift their head above the foxhole, they know they're going to get shot, right? Nobody has their backs.
By the way, I don't know how many of you have seen the YouTube video of the bridge that's built right in central Beijing. It's an 8-lane highway, and it is completed. Now, to be fair, they literally built the bridge already, and they trundle it over on huge wheels and put it down and then just pave the on and off ramps. It's done in less than 48 hours, and you can watch it on your YouTube at obviously an accelerated pace. And I remember Graham Allison, who wrote that great book, Destined for War, about can US and China avoid the Thucydides trap, used to contrast the speed of that bridge being constructed, again, in central Beijing, with the pace of a 2-lane bridge over the Charles River up in Cambridge that connects one side of Harvard with the other, and took something like 7 or 8 years. By the way, there is still one forlorn orange cone sitting at one end of the bridge that still hasn't been picked up. I'll see if it's there today or not. But again, not a reassuring comparison. And I'm not saying that we should have necessarily a governmental structure like that, but it certainly has enabled the construction of infrastructure that is just breathtaking. If you've watched it over a number of years, as many in this room no doubt will have.
The bridge in Boston, by the way, is called the Anderson Bridge, sadly. Yes, sir. It's right behind you.
General, hi, Norm, good morning. To sort of help galvanize this, from your vantage point, could this be talked about from a national security standpoint? Is there a potential national security issue if we do not do anything? And the follow-up is, if there is, I mean, how do we get that message? Maybe that's a way to sort of bubble this up and get people behind the issue.
Yeah, look, I think that's certainly one element of this, because certainly a number of these projects would have national security implications. The satellite constellation that we're going to recognize later today, some of the energy, a number of these major projects that will be recognized have either a very significant or a somewhat significant national security implication. That said, I think it's vastly more than that, needless to say, because again, what we really have to do is focus on the importance, the critical importance of productivity enhancement. And again, that's really the key to GDP growth. And GDP growth otherwise is sort of capped. I mean, the economists talk about potential for GDP growth and whether we're above or below that, depending on a variety of different factors that go into that. And in this case, what you're talking about is shifting the entire potential for GDP growth because you are enabling infrastructure that will in turn enable that greater growth. And I mean, I think that's relatively easy to explain, and people can get that, beyond which, I mean, people drive and are transported and all the rest of that on and over inadequate infrastructure all the time. It's not foreign to people who have, you know, now we may go into a decent airport in LaGuardia when they're done, or Kennedy, which is gradually refurbishing and replacing terminals. But then you get on the road and bridge infrastructure to get into New York City proper to Manhattan. And of course, the contrast between modern and existing is very, very distinct. Other questions?
We have time for one more question. There's one in the back.
Okay, right there.
Building on your productivity point and the security point, do you see the systems of infrastructure we have in the country just a matter of refurbishing them, or is there a missing approach to the systems that we're looking at? Like in the 50s, there was the interstates were put in. Is there something we're missing, or is it simply a matter of refurbishing?
Well, I think that certain elements of our mass transit system obviously are missing. Again, why the United States among developed countries of the world has the least adequate rail infrastructure. And I'm not just talking between major cities, I'm also talking in many cases within major municipal areas. I got it, how tough it is to do anything. I understand fully the challenges of construction in a place like New York City or LA or what have you. And those are real difficulties, and the regulation is there in many cases, and the oversight for reasons, some past experiences that didn't go well. But we've got to get a lot better than that, certainly. Our own experiences here with the metro system that was really exciting, gosh, now I guess it's 25 or so years ago. I remember we've literally watched this be built with repetitive tours through the Pentagon and Fort Myer when I was deployed for my wife. But yet we haven't maintained it. And real horror stories, of course, about what has resulted from that. So, but that at least exists. Many of our other major cities just do not have the kind of intra-city mass transit, again, particularly when it comes to rail. And then we're totally inadequate when it comes to rail between our major cities. And again, the best example of all certainly is that which runs from Washington through New York to Boston and Philly, and why that is so unbelievably inadequate. And you can get on one in Birmingham, England, and ride to London, and it is first class by comparison. So again, I think it's a mix of these, but certainly the lack of this in some places is absolutely really beyond regrettable.
So let me sneak in another question before we have the recognition ceremony. Who leads this effort? This is the big issue. This is called the Strategic Infrastructure Leadership Forum. I've never seen an infrastructure project that didn't get done through heroic effort of the person in charge of the project, or an initiative getting done through that kind of leadership. Who leads this effort? Because it's not the normal kind of leadership. It really is, as you're suggesting, General. It needs to come obviously from the White House. But who's the kind of person? What would you look for?
You know, again, it's going to be somebody who is invested in driving this, who develops the campaign, the big ideas, but then drives the implementation of the big ideas. Again, the surge that mattered most was the surge of ideas, but then what mattered most, because strategic leaders get paid to perform 4 tasks, I believe. The first is get the big ideas right. By the way, if you don't get that right, everything you build from that point on is on a shaky intellectual foundation. But you got to get the big ideas right. I've explained some of the big ideas that were the underpinning of the surge. Then you have to communicate the big ideas through the breadth and depth of the organization, and in a complex organization, that's not just down, it's laterally, it's up, it's to, in our case, to 30 plus countries and so on. That's huge, so that the people who are actually implementing the big ideas, turning them into reality at their level. I used to say that, the strategic lieutenant and strategic sergeant who's going outside the wire, turning big ideas at my level into real action at theirs, and never knowing if they're going to be greeted by a hand grenade or a handshake, but ready to respond appropriately to either. And we called them strategic because their tactical level actions could actually have strategic consequences. Most significantly, actually, when a very serious mistake is made. But then the third task is you oversee the implementation of the big ideas. This is the actual, what we normally think of as leadership. This is the driving, it's how the leader of it spends his or her time, a whole battle rhythm of everything that you do. We had a big, huge chart that showed what I did on a daily basis, because again, you're doing it 7 days a week in combat. What did we do a few times a week, couple times a week, every other week, monthly gathering of all the commanders and so forth, the quarterly ambassador and general overseeing comprehensive civil military campaign review. So that is crucially important, but that's also where you have the individual who's giving energy, providing example, who's hiring and firing, who is motivating people. All of this, that's in that particular bucket. And then you get down here a task that's often overlooked and should be done formally, so you make sure you don't overlook it. And that is to sit down and determine how you need to refine the big ideas and do it again and again and again. And by the way, keep in mind that Kodak, as an example, had thousands, not just hundreds, but thousands of patents on digital photography, but didn't capitalize on them quickly enough and got taken out of that particular arena. They missed that huge development. By the way, this is very applicable to civilian firms as well. You think about Netflix and Reed Hastings, one of the great strategic leaders of the world. First big idea is we're going to get movies in the hands of customers without brick and mortar, put Blockbuster out of business. That's the big idea, communicates it, oversees it, gets down here 2 years later. How's it going? Well, Blockbuster is slowly going out of business, but now others are into our business. By the way, test question, how many Blockbusters left? I think there's one in Big Bend, Oregon, and there's maybe one in someplace in Alaska, both of which are wonderfully, delightfully contrarian communities who refuse to allow their Blockbuster to go away, even as they are subscribing to Netflix. But anyway, so the next big idea is we're going to download content because broadband speeds are fast enough. Communicate it, oversee it, get down here, how's that going? Fantastic, really exciting. Revenues skyrocketing. By the way, they're starting to go global in here somewhere along the line, but then they said, now everybody else is doing that. What do we do now? Well, let's produce our own content. Let's bet $100 million on House of Cards alone and Breaking Bad and all these other iconic now series. So new idea, communicate it, execute it, get down here. How's that going? Well, fantastic, except now, of course, Amazon and HBO and all these other Showtime are all doing the same thing. What do we do now? Well, let's buy a couple of big production studios and we're going to make our own big movies. And you may recall the very first one of these had Brad Pitt playing General McChrystal, my close battlefield comrade when he was in Afghanistan. And it was horrible. With great respect to Brad Pitt, who I normally think is a great actor. In this one, he was very mechanical. I mean, he was like a little toy soldier marching around and, and very wooden, and Stan has a great sense of humor and all that. And besides that, I was devastated that Brad Pitt didn't hold out to play me. But anyway, but you see how this system works. If you ever want to, I have actually mapped this all out. There's a website at the Belfer Center at Harvard. If you Google or search Petraeus on strategic leadership at the Belfer Center website, you can have it all explained for you. We spent about a year building a project on that. That's actually, if you come back to this, what do we need? We need strategic leadership that gets the big ideas right and then can drive them in implementation. And even if a strategic leader is making it look as if it is effortless, which is sort of what you'd like to do. I remember when I was CI director, you had this incredible, unbelievable workforce, truly quiet professionals, and most unbelievable professionals, but not silent warriors, we called them. And I would, because I had a reasonable level entry position there, I would sort of say, look, I could go to sleep and you guys wouldn't even notice if I didn't wake up for a couple of days, all the rest of that. Well, not really so true. You drive campaigns, you drive the implementation of, again, and you drive the performance of these 4 big tasks of a strategic leader, and that's what we clearly need when it comes to infrastructure improvements in the U.S.
Great.
And why what you're doing is important.
Well, thank you very much, General. Please give the General a warm hand.